I'm from the far distant future year of, wait, what year is it? 2018? Geez, I'm from the future year of 2021. I'm back in the past to right the wrongs, but my calculations were off. So while I wait for my cyber comrades to come rescue me, let's talk about movies. I've always been a fan of films set in the future. They're either laughably bad or profound masterpieces, and I love both of those things. So today I'm going to be talking about cyberpunk, which is a genre which spans comic books, TV, games, literature, and especially movies. Recently I put out a survey asking people if they've heard the term cyberpunk. Out of 41 people who responded, 26 said yes and 15 said they haven't. So in this video essay, I'm going to explain genre, I'm going to explain cyberpunk, and we're going to look at a few movies and see if they're cyberpunk or not. So let's get started. Genre is a complicated subject, even if you limit the scope to film and film alone. Therefore, I'm going to give a brief breakdown of genre and explain to you some of the nuances.
Genre is essentially the categorization of media, and in film it can be done many ways: by type, by director, by studio, by star, by decade, and so on. For example, you'll get labels like comedy movies, Spielberg movies, Disney movies, Tom Cruise movies, and 80s movies.
Genres are bound together by codes and conventions, which are a loose set of traits shared by any film in a given genre. For instance, musicals have musical numbers, horrors have monsters/killers, and westerns are set during the American period of westward expansion. Conventions come from repetition and difference, as movies within a given genre aren't exactly copies of each other, but conventions are how they're related. Genre is a good way to talk about film because it enhances the discourse and gives people a language in which to talk about film and easily identify the type of film that they enjoy. Films within a given genre don't conform completely to conventions. So there are things like subgenres and hybrid genres. Example of subgenre would be slapstick as a subgenre of comedy, and an example of a hybrid genre would be an action comedy. There's a little breakdown of genre. Now let's get on to talk about cyberpunk. Cyberpunk is a subgenre of science fiction. The term originates from the title of a short story written by Bruce Bethke in 1983. In 1984 was the release of William Gibson's debut novel, Neuromancer, and that's when it was considered a genre. But what are the codes and conventions of cyberpunk? In simple terms, it's high-tech and low-life. In more specific terms, cyberpunk works tend to take place in the future/near future with a morally ambiguous protagonist. Cyberpunk themes tend to cover a range of topics, but most often they have corporations taking over the world with either an ineffectual or non-existent or corrupt government. Aesthetically, they blend high future technology with past architecture, art, and costume design. This is called retrofuturism. Cyberpunk tends to feature dense urban environments with plentiful criminal elements and the wealthy elites living high above the rest of the population. So, what are the codes and conventions of cyberpunk? Well, let's come up with a list so we can talk about them when we go over our selection of films later.
So let's come up with a few codes and conventions in which we will look for when we go through a selection of films later. Number 1. Once upon a time in the not so distant future. The story should be set in the future, acting as a work of speculative fiction, but, as you will see, they tend to be set in the near future. Number 2. Tech impact. Advanced technology is present or directly influences the plot, very much the cyber part of cyberpunk. Number 3. Corporate takeover. Corporations tend to be, if not antagonistic, incredibly prevalent in the world of cyberpunk, with government or politicians being absentee, ineffectual, or just corrupt. Number 4. My beautiful, dark, twisted future. Manifestations of cyberpunk on film tend to have a distinct visual aesthetic. Whether it's through visual effects, composition, costume/set design, or lighting, they tend to use these techniques to look visually dense and striking. Number 5. No more heroes. The protagonists of cyberpunk share the quality of being morally dubious. Whether they are lowlifes, criminals, or law enforcement working for an oppressive system, they aren't moral champions to rally around, even if they do something good. Number 6. Low resolution. Finally, cyberpunk films tend to abstain from giving the audience complete closure. This leaves narrative open-ended and up for interpretation. Although it's not an essential feature to Cyberpunk, it's featured enough to warrant talking about.
Now, let's go back further in time to look at the origins of Cyberpunk film.
Blade Runner was released in 1982, directed by Ridley Scott and stars Harrison Ford as Deckard, the titular Blade Runner. While it wasn't overly commercially or critically successful, the film has gained a cult following through the years, and it's also had multiple cuts released to the public, although I will be using the final cut version. Set in Los Angeles in 2019, so only a year away, it follows Deckard, a man who retires replicants. Replicants are genetically synthesized life forms who are, as advertised by the Tyrell Corporation, more human than human. Retirement refers to the execution of these replicants, which is carried out by Blade Runners, as it's their job. Replicants are used as an exploitable and disposable workforce in the off-world colonies, where they have been engineered to only live for 4 years. This is where the hunted replicants come in. Roy Batty, the leader of the group of renegade replicants, wants to extend his life past the 4-year expiry date. We follow him as he tries to find someone to reverse his biological engineering, up to confronting his creator, Dr. Eldon Tyrell, head of the Tyrell Corporation, and killing him, which is reminiscent of the relationship between Dr. Frankenstein and his creation. This movie touches on many thematic elements such as personhood, working for an oppressive system, and the ethical consideration of genetic engineering. It's a fantastic film, but you do kinda need to be in the mood to watch it. It checks off everything I have on my list, which is understandable, because it's what most people picture when you say cyberpunk. Now, let's go to the 90s. Johnny Mnemonic was released in 1995, directed by Robert Longo, starring Keanu Reeves, and most importantly written by William Gibson. This movie isn't great. I chose to talk about this as one of 2 movies adapted from the work of William Gibson, who, as I mentioned earlier, wrote the first cyberpunk novel. The acting throughout the film is pretty wooden and unconvincing, but the rest of the film has interesting elements. Visually, it sporadically switches between the CG world of cyberspace, while the rest is live action. The story centers around Johnny, a mnemonic courier who is tasked with carrying data around in equipment hardwired to his brain. Early in the film, Johnny receives a larger amount of data, which exceeds his capacity, which contains the information for a cure to a disease which has been plaguing this future. The pharmaceutical company want this data back, because they don't want the cure to get out, as it's more profitable for them to treat the disease than to cure it, which is a relevant topic, even today. This film passes the criteria I outlined earlier, except for that the ending is quite conventional and hopeful. The cure data gets released to the public, presumably ending the future plague. Now, let's go to the aughts. A Scanner Darkly was released in 2006, written and directed by Richard Linklater, and again, starring Keanu Reeves. A Scanner Darkly might seem like an odd choice in the selection meant to showcase cyberpunk, but hear me out. Looking at the conventions I outlined before, it takes place in the future, advanced technology is part of the story, the police being ineffectual is at the core of the story, it has a distinct visual aesthetic, although not retro-futurist or technology influence. The lead character is a drug-addled undercover cop, and the film ends with clear terms of irresolution. The main character is Bob Arthur, an undercover cop tasked with finding the supplier for Substance D, a new drug sweeping America. The film follows him as he slowly descends into madness, hallucinations, and paranoia. This aided by the animation technique known as rotoscoping, where the film is shot on camera, then each frame is traced over, combining live action and animation. The conclusion of the film reveals that the private company that rehabilitates Substance D users also creates the drug, which is oddly foreshadowed by a cameo from Alex Jones, the notable conspiracy theorist, which looking at the film a decade later feels weird with his hand in the rise of Donald Trump. Now let's get to this decade. Well, kinda. High Rise was released in 2015, directed by Ben Wheatley and starring Tom Hiddleston. This film is what I'd consider retro cyberpunk. It takes place in the future of the past. It straddles the line between period piece and speculative fiction. It was adapted from a novel of the same name by J.G. Ballard that was released in 1975. The novel was part of the New Wave science fiction movement, which was a direct inspiration for cyberpunk. The film is set in the 70s, but a future conceived by the 70s. The film looks at the descent into chaos of white middle class and upper class people who live in a luxury tower block. The film is about class war, but not between the working class and upper classes. Instead, it's lower middle class people, and upper class people, all vying for dominance. The collapse in social order is caused by flaws in the building, as utilities such as lifts, water, the supply of food and electricity start failing. The people get violent. The film is quite good at conveying its message, even ending with a recording of Margaret Thatcher speaking about capitalism. The film hits all the cyberpunk conventions I laid out, except the corporate takeover one, as the film is more about an isolated societal collapse rather than a widespread collapse as seen in other films.
That's it. I've just been hailed by my cyber compatriots on my comlink, so I've got to go back. But let me wrap things up first. Through the process of making this video, I've come to appreciate science fiction and cyberpunk a lot more. There are a lot of films that I could have talked about, but I've had to cut them due to time. The thing I love about films set in the future is they're obviously a work of speculation. No one can really know what's going to happen in the future. In my survey, I asked people, do you think films set in the future / near future reflect our current society? Of the 40 people who answered, 25 said yes. And it's quite obvious when you look at these films that they do reflect the society that they were made in. I hope you've learned something from this video, because I've certainly learned something from making it. Now, it's time to go back to the year where it all went bad, 1998.